Gender studies is a field that explores how gender is shaped more by culture than by nature. It sees gender as a social construct, meaning that what we understand as masculine and feminine changes over time and across different cultures. The nature of gender is fluid. Showalter's cultural model of feminism emphasizes the importance of analyzing literature and society through a gendered perspective. Since the late 1960s and 1970s, feminists and gender critics, including scholars from gay and lesbian studies, have worked together to challenge oppression and inequality. Traditionally, literature was often described using masculine terms such as calling a piece of writing virile or seminal, implying that male perspectives were the norm. Today, critics argue that this is limiting and that gender must be actively considered when analyzing texts. Myra Jelen points out that traditional critics often oversimplify sexuality and literary criticism should involve both action and reflection. She emphasizes that we must consciously read for gender in texts even when authors do not explicitly discuss it. Both feminist and gender critics argue that society treats binary categories like masculine and feminine or heterosexual and homosexual as natural when these categories are created by culture. David Richer points out that rules about gender and sexuality have nothing to do with nature and everything to do with societal norms. For instance, terms like homosexual and heterosexual were not widely used before the late 19th century. In ancient Greece, especially in Periclean Athens, elite men often had relationships with both women and younger men, and these relationships were socially accepted. This historical perspective shows that sexuality is not fixed but exists on a continuum. Similarly, masculinity and femininity are constantly evolving. For example, in the past, women wearing fatigues and smoking cigars might have been seen as unusual, but today some men find such traits attractive. Ross Murfin agrees that gender is a cultural construct rather than a biological fact. It influences daily interactions, such as an older man holding the door open for a young woman. Her reaction, whether she expects it, resents it, or has mixed feelings, depends on how gender roles have shaped her thinking. Teresa de Lauretis introduces the idea of technologies of gender, which refers to how media, cinema, and other cultural forces shape gender roles. She builds on Michel Foucault's theory that sexuality is not purely personal or natural, but is shaped by political and cultural forces. According to her, nothing exists outside of culture, meaning even our ideas about gender and sexuality are constructed by societal norms. The Stonewall riots of the late 1960s marked a turning point for gay, lesbian, and transgender rights, leading to new studies on the history of LGBTQ literature and the misrepresentation of these groups in mainstream culture. Adrian Rich introduced the idea of compulsory heterosexuality, arguing that heterosexuality is enforced by society as a way to maintain male dominance. Other critics have analyzed historical literature through a lesbian perspective. For instance, Sharon O'Brien explored Willa Cather's complex relationship with her sexuality. Terry Castle studied how 18th century literature avoided mentioning lesbian relationships, and Lillian Faderman examined female relationships in the Renaissance. Lesbian critics challenge the marginalization of their perspectives by asserting lesbianism as a critical lens through which to read literature. They use terms like alterity, women centered, and difference to highlight the unique experiences of women who love women. However, disagreements have emerged between lesbian and heterosexual feminists. Some lesbian feminists argue that lesbianism should be seen as the natural way for women to relate to one another, which has led to tensions with heterosexual feminists. Despite these debates, lesbian critics have played a crucial role in highlighting the works of lesbian authors and expanding feminist literary analysis. They focus on ambiguity, open ended narratives, mirror imagery, secret codes, and experimental language. For example, Gertrude Stein's poetry and Virginia Woolf's novels reflect a distinctively lesbian perspective. Lesbian critics also study genres like the female gothic and female utopias, as well as experimental writers like Radcliffe Hall, Colet, and Juna Barnes. In 1978, the first volume of Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality was translated, which had a significant impact on gender and sexuality studies. Foucault argued that homosexuality was historically constructed as a category in the 19th century by medical and social institutions. Before this period, same sex acts existed but were not labeled as a fixed identity. His ideas influenced scholars in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly with the emergence of queer theory. Queer theory developed in response to both feminist and LGBTQ studies. It gained momentum in the late 1980s during the AIDS crisis, when scholars like Sedgwick and Michael Warner sought to challenge the stigma surrounding queer identities. They reclaimed the word queer, which had been used as an insult, and turned it into a symbol of pride and resistance. Queer theorists argue that sexuality is separate from gender and that it should not be confined to rigid categories like male, female, gay, or straight. This idea has sparked controversy in academic circles as traditional values are being replaced by more fluid and ambiguous understandings of identity. One of the most famous works in queer theory is Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, where she examines how society constructs and polices sexual identities. She describes sexuality as a complex system of actions, expectations, narratives, pleasures, and identities. Lauren Berland and Michael Warner further developed this idea, arguing that a queer public includes not only LGBTQ individuals but also people who reject rigid gender and sexual norms. They emphasize that queerness is about embracing fluidity and resisting conventional societal expectations. Queer theory also has roots in 19th century aesthetics, particularly in the ideas of Oscar Wilde and the art for art's sake movement. Scholars like Donald Morgan argue that desire is an uncontainable excess that exists beyond social norms and historical constraints. This perspective aligns with Nietzsche's anarchic skepticism, which challenges fixed categories of meaning. Queer theorists analyze narrative features such as subplots, vernacular speech, euphemisms, jokes, and audience reaction. They view the internet as queer because it is constantly evolving and resists fixed definitions. Queer readings of literature have transformed how scholars interpret classic works. For example, Alan Sinfield has offered new perspectives on Shakespeare's plays, revealing hidden sexual themes. Other scholars have revisited writers like Walt Whitman, uncovering previously overlooked aspects of his work related to desire and sexuality. In recent years, LGBTQ representation has become more visible in mainstream culture. Gay characters, themes, and storylines now appear in television shows, Hollywood films, and other media. While debates over issues like same sex marriage continue, the influence of queer perspectives in literature, art, and public discourse is undeniable. The emergence of a gay aesthetic has challenged traditional norms and reshaped cultural conversations about gender and sexuality.